Hi, thanks for joining me on today's episode of The Learning Curve. On today's episode, we talk with Josh CT, also known as PsyKick, capital P, capital K. And I get into a lot of his background in education and his experiences because he has a very unique perspective that he provides that I think is so helpful for everyone to hear. He went to school in multiple states, and he also has experienced a lot of different forms of education, approaches to education, and he talks about what worked well for him, how he can help advocate for himself, how he learned to speak up, and how that shapes what he does today. So I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I did, because he's a wonderful guy. And let's get into it.
You are listening to The Learning Curve with Miss Tallene. This is a space where you can feel empowered to think about education differently.
All right. Hey, Josh.
Hi.
Thanks for joining me today. Will you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you?
Yeah, my name's Josh Corbin Tomlinson. I go by PsyKick online, PsyKick, capital P, capital K. I am 23 years old. I am a senior in college at California State University, Northridge, getting a BA in filmmaking and, film production is what they like to call it. It's not filmmaking, it's film production. It's the same thing.
They're fancier words.
Exactly. I've moved around a lot. I've got two dads. One who built performing arts centers around the country, and so because of that, we moved around a lot as he bounced between different states to erect new performance halls for their local municipalities or cities or whatnot. And so I bounced around between a lot of schools, between a lot of different states, and had my fair share in that before I finally landed in California in 2019. So right before the pandemic hit.
Oh, so you're new to California. Okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Pretty
Okay.
new.
I can't wait to dive into some of this because you texted me a little bit about your background, and I had no idea that you had so much varied experiences with the different types of like education and stuff like that. And so I can't wait to hear about all of it and everything about your life. You sound fascinating to me, and you make great work. And I know
Thank you.
I met you through my husband because you would do freestyling on an app. I forget which app. Was
The
it
Bars
Stereo
app.
or Bars? Okay.
And Stereo. He got me. That's his fault. He got me in Stereo.
He does that.
And Clubhouse. He's like, hey, have you heard of Clubhouse? I'm like, no, what's that? He's like, oh, you're gonna like it. I'm like, all righty. And I do like it, but I liked it because I got to freestyle with him. I didn't like it because of it on its own. I'm not a drop-in podcaster like him. I'm not a podcaster like him. He's on another level. So.
Yeah. He's a creative of his own species too. Like we're all kind of got our different niches and stuff. And I've only heard wonderful things about you and how talented you are. And you're on the younger end of a lot of the other people that were on those apps with you, and from what I heard and things like that. But he would constantly sing your praises and say like, but despite his age, he's the best of us all. Like he was really singing your praises. Yeah,
that's kind of him.
Yeah. So and through that we've learned, you've developed a friendship of sorts, and then we've gotten into a working relationship with each other. You edit my podcasts, and I've been enjoying our process so far, and you're so on top of everything. So I want to know how you got here. Tell me about your life. We'll take it step by step, just like
don't worry, I'm used to this. I've got the whole origin story.
Yeah.
If only I was good at drawing comic books, I could make something of that.
I know a guy. I don't know if you got into episode 3 yet for editing, but I know a guy.
I haven't.
So.
I got through episode 2, and then I'm like, well, I know I'm being interviewed Friday, so let me get through that and then see, then restart the editing process.
Yeah. And I know you're at the end of your semester, so a lot's going on.
Yeah, it's getting hectic because here at the same time while we're doing finals, and especially since I'm doing some extra general ed just to get some more credits, even though I already have that completed.
Mm-hmm.
we also have these $35,000 senior thesis films in pre-production, transitioning into production at the start of this month, the start of May, on some of them, and then of course continuing throughout the summer. And so it's getting hectic because everybody's
Wow.
like, "Hey, so can you help us on this film project?" And I'm like, No, I can't. I mean, you should have asked me 4 months ago. I'd love to. So it's been very hectic past 2 months, and it's just ramping up.
Yeah.
But so I was I don't know where to. I'll start in the very beginning,
Okay, that's helpful.
the dawn of man. No, no, I was born in Russia, and I was adopted at 18 months. Um, so I was born in 2000. By the time my parents got a civil union because marriage wasn't legal then for gay
Hmm.
couples. And, that always, like, people don't think about that. They don't, and a lot of people don't realize that in my entire adolescence, all the way through the beginning of my teenage years, my parents weren't allowed to be legally married.
Right.
Certain states, but we moved around so much that that wasn't efficient. So, yeah, so it wasn't federal until June of 2014.
Wow.
So
Well,
wasn't until I
congratulations
was
to them.
14. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So anyway, so they got their civil union, which is what we consider marriage in our
Hmm.
household,
Yeah.
and they got it the day after 9/11.
Wow.
In fact, on their way there, they flew over the towers as they were on fire, and had to get grounded because they're headed to Vermont, and they got grounded in Boston, I believe, and had to drive the rest of the way.
Wow.
Uh, yeah, so
Wow.
that all happened, and then one of my dads went to Russia about a month later to pick me up. He already saw me a few months earlier and was like, "This is the one." And it was more complex than that. But then
Right.
went over and decided to get me. And the trick was, at the time, because of 9/11 and because of the Muslim population in Chechnya and surrounding areas that used to be Soviet states, they were having a resurgence and trying to kickstart a revolution because Putin just became president. They weren't a fan of this KGB Soviet like person. So they were causing acts of terrorism throughout different regions in Russia. And the region that I was born in is on the very southmost side of, like directly below Moscow, in Pyatigorsk. And it was it's right near the Black Sea.
Okay.
And um, so the hospital I was born in, apparently, I mean, it's hard to find actual scientific evidence in Russia, but
Right.
apparently a few months after I was born, there was blown up from a terrorist attack. So it was a very contentious time, and they didn't want people coming in or leaving their country. So, especially an American, and you can't be gay in Russia. So my dad had to pose as a straight white man,
Hmm.
and act like he had a wife at home who was busy or something.
Right. Right.
And yeah, and it was a lot of cash money bribery to get through and traverse, and a lot of spy work. It's definitely a spy like film, uh,
Right. It
that
sounds
could
like
be
a
told
movie.
from it. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's very
absolutely.
very cinematic. So that's how it began. And then of course, I was brought back. My parents were living in Miami at the time, but at the same time they were literally in the transition of moving. So I was raised in Atlanta, Georgia, for the
Hmm.
first 11 years of my life. And I have a
Oh,
birth certificate there. They were able to get me dual citizenship, because they didn't want any headaches down the line
yeah.
if there were ever to be any more.
Hmm.
So on my birth certificate, it says I was born in Atlanta, Georgia, as well as I have an alternate one that says I was born in Russia.
Wow.
Um,
Wow.
so I don't carry a dual citizenship anymore. That expired a while ago, but I guess I don't really want to anymore with
With
Russia.
all
So
the
it
stuff
doesn't.
going on.
It
Yes.
used to be kind of impressive, and now I have to keep my mouth shut. So,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, so that was so Atlanta, Georgia, for the first 11 years of my life, and then we moved to Kentucky when I was 11,
Hmm.
and just in my last year of middle school, I believe, or I'm sorry, in my last year of elementary, transitioning into middle school, that's when I moved to Kentucky, and then about 3 years there, then South Carolina, and then 3 years, and then North Carolina, and
Hmm.
then I moved to California. So
Wow.
about 2.5 to 3 years for each of those states post Georgia, and then moved here, and I've been here for About four. So
Nice. Now, you
yeah.
mentioned that they were opening performing arts centers all around. Are they still responsible for these performing arts centers, or do
No,
they
no, no.
hand them
He,
off?
my dad not only like oversaw the building of it and the funding and fundraising and all of
Hmm.
that, and then he ran it as the director, executive director, whichever the title was for the place at the times, for a couple years, and then he just got it up, got it running, and then said, "Okay, here you go," and then we left. So he's retired now. He's in his 70s. So and my other dad's now running a local senior center
Cool.
in Cathedral City. So and not like not a retirement home, just a recreational place for seniors to socialize and to get actual support for their needs. So
That's
yeah,
awesome.
it's all good stuff.
It's all necessary, super
Yeah.
necessary. Now, you mentioned that you had experienced, the traditional public school setting, but you've also experienced Montessori. You mentioned Orton Gillingham. So I wanted to dive into some of these things because part of the point of this podcast is to show how varying education platforms exist and what they do and how they affected you specifically would be awesome
Yeah.
to dive into. So you said you went from public to private to traditional to Orton, the Orton Gillingham method, and then Montessori also. So,
Yeah. No, I bounced around between a lot of different methods throughout my life and philosophies and teaching. Um, so the Orton Gillingham method, from what I've learned of it, and hopefully I've learned enough of it, considering I went to three of the 11 at the time. There might be more now. Schools in the world that fully taught them.
yeah.
So I ought to know how this works. Basically, it's hands-on learning. It's project-based learning. It's reverse engineering the process. So instead of saying, oh, well, just figure it out, and the end result is what matters, it's
Mm-hmm.
saying, okay, well, yes, the end result is important, especially when it comes to the math and sciences of your subjects, but the process and the figuring out the intricacies and the project management of such is more important. Um, they still taught general ed. It's no different, but it's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
the way in teaching it. It's not just a straight up lecture. Okay, this is what happened with George Washington. There's some lecture. You can't not have that, but that it's like, okay, and now we have to build the little boat that, sailed across the Delaware or whatever.
Yeah.
We didn't actually have to do that, but it would be something like that,
Yeah. Yeah. More hands on.
more hands-on to reinforce whatever we were learning at the time, and it just varies in complexity
Mm-hmm.
depending on your age and what subject you're doing.
Right. Right.
So and it wasn't like a lab either. When I tell people that, they're like, oh, so like a lab, and it's like, no, 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 it's not a lab. It's I mean, it can be, but it that's more of a like a, oh, just look at this and um write up this huge analytical report. I mean, we did have to learn that eventually, but that wasn't until much later. So yeah, I started. I mean, I went to preschools, I went to private and public schools, all these kinds of things. Um, I had a myriad of learning disabilities that I was diagnosed with early on, and at first my parents thought or feared that I was going to be completely nonverbal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they weren't sure if it was the language barrier because in Russia, for so many years, I was just hearing Russian. So
Right.
all of a sudden, switching languages within the course of a couple weeks,
Mm-hmm.
and that would stunt anybody at the
That's
development
true. There is
age.
known to be a delay if
Yeah,
you are growing up bilingual or you're hearing more than one language in the house. There will be like a verbal delay most of the time.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that was the fear at first. And yeah, no, there probably was a delay, and there's some delays in the motor functions as well.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I think they said I didn't crawl until I was 2.5.
Mm-hmm.
So things of that nature. And then later, anxiety. I was diagnosed with OCD at age 9. Anxiety. I was diagnosed with all anxiety, general anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and depression. They're like,
Oh.
I was diagnosed with that at 9. They're like, yeah, you got all those. I'm like, well, it kind of makes sense and why I've been
Yeah.
having these
Right.
intrusive thoughts and anxiety. And like, now what? I'm only
Yeah.
9 and I'm knowing this. So I'm thankful I was diagnosed then, because then I was able to get the help and learn the resources and take it seriously and really focus on managing that for the past, you know, 11, 12 years now. So
Can we stop right there for just a second? I have a
yeah,
couple of questions for you.
yeah, no problem.
Regarding that because um at our school, the one I work at,
Hmm.
we first of all, I'm being trained in the Orton Gillingham method. I started it in February of 2020,
Oh,
which
okay,
was a
nice.
terrible time. And,
Yeah, bad
and then
timing for
so
that.
I could not finish it. And so I've been dragging my feet trying to finish it up. And then I know that that method is often compared or used for specifically dyslexic children as well.
Yes.
Did you suffer from
No,
or did you have dyslexia?
I didn't have dyslexia, thank God.
Okay, yeah,
I
but the
think
or
that
I
might
know
have
that
been the
that method
fear.
helps no matter
Yeah,
what a lot
it
of the
helps
time.
everybody, and that's
Yeah.
something I've learned over the years, that even if you don't have a learning disability, it's just a helpful and different way of learning.
Yeah.
Unless, of course, if you've learned more traditionally for the first 10, 12, 13 years of your life, then
Hmm.
if you switched to the Orton Gillingham, you're gonna struggle. That's
Right.
that's not going to be as fun. But for the most part, it's even then, it's still manageable to switch over. It's
Hmm.
not impossible. And yeah, it's helpful for any age. But yes, funny, I didn't have ADHD, I didn't have dyslexia.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of my doctors when I was younger, apparently, uh, suspected I had autism. I don't know if it was officially diagnosed, but looking back on it now, thinking about it now, I'm like, oh no, definitely. I go down the checklist, or I look at, I'm like, oh yeah, no, that's the most relatable thing I've ever seen.
Yeah. You're like,
This
that's
makes,
me.
like, when it all clicked one day, I was like, holy shit. And I was friends with JD at the time, and I was just like, wow, I can't believe that that all clicked. And I told him, and he's like, it's no surprise. I'm like, I know. I've
Now
always
you just have
suspected.
a label for it.
I wasn't completely in the dark, but now I have a label. Now I have a way of looking at it, so it helped in that sense. But yes, there's a lot of people with dyslexia, a lot of people with ADHD. I believe um, that is the Orton Gillingham especially helps people with dyslexia and ADHD,
Hmm.
um, and autism, but it really does help with those three primarily more than any other demographic. Not to say it can't help anybody, regardless
Right.
of your learning disability, because it's a different way of learning, but it's not so far off the beaten path that it's not relating to things that you may do in a more traditional public setting. And I think that's something that's really important to note, because there are other learning methods or philosophies, while as great as they are so far off the beaten path that the learning curve, no pun intended. I just realized I said that as I was saying it.
There's a reason why we named it that.
Yeah, that's clever. See, I'm a video game player, so I use learning curve a lot, because that's how
Yeah.
you gauge people's uh, ability to learn and pick up and play. But that's gonna come and bite me a lot while I edit this.
Yeah.
Just,
No, I think
oh
that's
my
really
god,
helpful.
he keeps saying it. Anyway. So, um, but the learning curve of someone who has to adjust from a, say, a more traditional education to a, which is usually more lecture based, maybe
Yeah.
some visual, and sometimes some projects, but at the tail end, and these projects aren't given enough time, and they're
They're
the
like
scale of,
peripheral. They're not like
exactly, they're
the
like, oh,
focus. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And even though they're peripheral, they carry the weight of finals projects, because usually that's how they're lined up, especially in high school. It's like, oh,
Right.
I mean, I can't tell you how many dioramas I did in middle school and high school. I'm like, how many this is not Orton Gillingham. I mean, sometimes you'll do them, but like, a lot of people thought at the time, especially in the South, and that's another difference when where you're being taught in America, at least. I can't speak internationally, but in America, when you're the different states, different regions, different politics and government and funding changes drastically the quality of your education when you're in a public setting. And in every state I've lived in, I also went to a public school for some time, longer than others in some instances. So it's not just like, oh, I bounce between private school to private school, which is usually what Orton Gillingham fully taught schools are. They're most often
Private.
private. In fact,
Hmm.
they're always private. Maybe they're not public at least. And so that's that's the other thing. When I tell people, I'm like, no, 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 I didn't just go private school, private school. I'd have no basis in other teaching methods or schools. I'd have no reason to be on this podcast speaking the experience because it would be so biased in that. No, I've done a little bit of everything in different states. Um, and California was kind of just, I finished up my senior semester in high school here and then switched to college. So that almost doesn't count just because that's
It
a
was such
completely
a
different.
short, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So, but yeah, the Orton Gillingham method was probably my favorite and most beneficial that I had the most through my education because I went to the Howard School in Atlanta. I transitioned to that in third grade.
Can you
That was
explain what
my
a Howard school is?
yeah. It's a K through 12 private school in Atlanta,
Hmm.
um, and they're still going today, and they specialize in the Orton Gillingham method.
Hmm.
Their highest demographic is kids with dyslexia,
Hmm.
autism, and ADHD.
Hmm.
There's none of those weird like, oh, this is a special ed room because they were all technically special ed rooms.
Yeah.
But I mean, not really, but they were, they had, it was, this place was awesome. I mean, I bounced from another private school that was just a little more smaller and more calm. It didn't have a different learning method. It was just nicer, I guess.
Was it inclusive in the sense that you had the general ed population in with the technically the special education population in the same space, or was the whole
Yes,
okay? That's
but
how
it,
our school is. We
but
have
it,
an inclusive strategy for
it,
our
yeah,
kiddos.
it was that. But to be honest with you, I think a lot of the people there, I would say the majority just had a learning disability.
Hmm.
Now, the severity of and the scale and the spectrum of that disability, varied. So there are some people who were nonverbal,
Hmm.
and there are people who had severe symptoms of whatever was afflicting them, and then there are people who were way, way, way less severe. I was one of the way less severes. Um, so I kind of stood out from the crowd, but
Right, right.
yeah, and it was interesting because when I went there, it was all about the educators and the teachers really prioritized things that weren't just curriculum. They really prioritized getting kids to be comfortable, to be sociable, to care about their mental and emotional well-being, which I think was, I mean, I think that's a vital, I
That's
think
the
that's more
biggest thing.
important
Yeah.
than a textbook and things of that nature. Uh, I say that though I've met some people who obviously didn't prioritize the books when they were younger. I'm like, oh, wow, how have you made it this far? So it's not to say that education isn't important, but it is to say that if it's taught in conjunction with emotional and mental growth and understanding and now analysis of that, either self or onto other people,
Hmm.
it just makes things better. And, I was dealing with severe OCD and anxiety at the time that was just being diagnosed that year,
Hmm.
right as I was moving. So not only was I in the midst of moving, um, and all of that, but I was also diagnosed with all these things and I was learning more about myself because of that, but I didn't understand it either
Hmm.
because I was 9. So how would you
Right.
understand something of the complexity of something like OCD or anxiety? Um, so they were really working on getting me to advocate for myself, to speak up, to because I just formed these habits in previous schools where I just stayed quiet when I
Yeah.
didn't know what was going on because things were going past me so fast, and I just figured I was too stupid to know better. And I think that's a feeling that a lot of people, grown and young, experience, and I still do to this day. When certain,
Hmm.
I'm like, wow, I guess I'm an idiot. I did not know, you know. But I think that feeling briefly is okay. That just means you're learning because you're completely in the deep. But I got left behind a lot of
What
times.
what helped you? start advocating for yourself or speaking up in the moment, because I noticed that with a lot of the kids I work with too. They
Yeah.
will shy away or be a wallflower, and to teach them to advocate for themselves, and
Hmm.
then or sometimes they advocate for themselves and it comes across very disrespectfully, and
Right.
then it turns
Too
into this like
brash.
ego battle with
Yeah.
the teacher or whatever adults in there. And so how do you teach them to, like, what works for you to be able to do something like that? Because that's a huge need and skill.
Hmm. And it connects to everything from the foundation building blocks of linguistics and of just self-actualization. The the thing that I realized, it was in third grade. It was right when I transitioned to school, and I was very quiet, and I didn't advocate for myself. I didn't talk very much, and man, that year did I ever learn what the word and every type of synonym and way that word can be used is advocacy. They pounded that in. And the way they did that is they didn't, it wasn't forceful. It wasn't like, okay, now stand up and speak for yourself. That wouldn't
Yeah.
have worked because I also had anxiety, So I was like, I'm too anxious to speak, regardless of my previous traumas. What the method that they approached was, well, it was, started with love and kindness and understanding that treating it like this person was hurt. So we have to make them feel safe and unhurt, or make them feel like they won't be hurt
Mm-hmm.
if they do choose to speak up whenever that may be. So it took a lot of patience and persistence from my teachers, a lot of tenacity, and I will always be thankful of that. But the method, the metric, and how they allowed me over time through the course of that year to get to that point was they didn't just look and evaluate my grades for what they were in terms of the academic sense. Of course they did, but they also had us at the end of every week write a self-report, and to be, they're like, be completely honest, because this self-report is not only going to be read by the teachers and analyzed by us, but we're also going to show it to your parents in the parent teacher conference when we have those quarterly or whatever it was. And so there's like a little rubric, like a little scorecard, and then you get to write a little bit about
Mm-hmm.
how you thought you did that week. And of course, I assume the teachers had their own reports to fill on how they see the students' growth and to benchmark that.
Right. That makes a ton of
And
sense to me, because
yeah,
then it puts an action in your control
absolutely.
to think about yourself for a little bit.
And it gives it a tangible objective. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we are complex beings, and we are busy beings, and our brain is firing so quickly. Especially someone with anxiety and OCD whose mind's, I don't have ADHD, thankfully, but my mind is still bouncing around. I'm just
Sure.
fortunate enough to be able to focus and have a, elephant's memory. So,
Good.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, so it's a blessing. But anyway, so the thing about that is that in that report card, so very often was I told throughout my third grade year that like it was always like at the bottom of the where the little teacher notes were like, remember, advocate for yourself. I'm like, oh yeah, I got to do that, huh? And it was just I kept seeing that, and I was like, okay, all right, and I mean, it's half of it's the willpower and desire from the student. I mean, if they don't have the desire or the will to do something, I mean, you can only get so far
Mm-hmm.
as an instructor. I think that's another thing. You're not going to be able to like hypnotize somebody and make them do something they wouldn't normally do. That's not feasible. So there has to be some desire or inclination that they would want to pursue that. And I think that was something I always wanted to do. I wanted to be able to advocate for myself. I just didn't know how to, and I didn't feel safe to. But once it was illustrated that I'm safe to and I'm encouraged to, and I'm rewarded when I was, I got like extra recess time or treats or candy or whatever it was at the time that a 9-year-old would like. And they told my parents that too. So at home as well, my parents reinforced that and decided to have more dialogue with me and decided to see where I can advocate for my tendencies and needs more, and rewarded it at home too. So it was a 24/7 process. And that was probably the smartest thing they did.
Yeah. So two things about what you just said. Like, I have a ton of thoughts. I'm writing them down as you're talking, because you're speaking to a lot of really, really big big things
Mhm.
that we face daily as educators, and parents are facing daily also. And I think a lot of times parents are stuck on what to do. Educators might be stuck on what to do.
Yeah.
And but one of the things that you talked about was extrinsic motivation. They gave you treats or extra recess, something that you can earn.
Right.
And then I think I'm gathering that you became intrinsically motivated. You didn't need those treats eventually. Like at some
Right.
point you can wean off of the extrinsic motivations and go to the intrinsic motivation and then work that way. I know the
Absolutely.
teachers that we work with, we try to say stuff like that to them because sometimes kids don't want to do the thing or get better or whatever. You have
Yep.
to use something to get there. And it's funny because our school is so big on trying to do positive reinforcement and but not use like behavior charts and things like that to, they want the kids to become intrinsically motivated. But oftentimes, like for a few kids here and there, we have to set up like a separate thing and then work with them and ideally the families, which is the second point that I wanted to talk about, to make that type of change. So the fact that your parents, your dads were so involved and carrying it through at home, do you feel like that was probably a huge part of the success in it, is that it was being reinforced at home
Oh,
as well?
my parents were the majority success of everything I am today, because they, even if they didn't understand it, right? I mean, one of my dads he was 50 when he had me, the other one was like 35 or around that age.
Mm-hmm.
And so one was younger, one was older.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so they were completely different generations. So that in of itself presented new ways that they approach things. My dad, who's older, who has always been supportive, never not been, but looks at things differently because the way he was taught was pull yourself up by the bootstraps. I mean, his father was a World War II pilot,
Yeah,
that was fought in the Pacific War, Pacific theater. So, um, way different mentality on how to raise
absolutely.
kids and stuff. And and then my other dad was like Generation Y or whatever, the one that's unhappy today, because they were neglected by their parents because their parents were all doing drugs and alcohol due to the 60s and 70s or something of that nature.
Yeah.
But no,
Yeah.
but in reality, it was because of them, because they cared so much. They understood the complexity of that. They were met with the challenge, and they knew adopting could present that issue, um, and so they were ready for it financially and mentally and emotionally. More importantly, they were there to support me. It wasn't always easy. They didn't always get it. So while I was experiencing symptoms of OCD, anxiety, depression, being behind in learning, I was experiencing it about a year or two at any given point and feeling those things before they realized I was. And before they could even take action on it, because it wasn't fully developed. It was just kind of a kernel, and it was slowly growing into an issue.
Right.
So it still presented many problems and fights as a little kid. And I was just like, oh my God, you guys don't get it. This sucks. And I can't explain how complex this is because I'm 8.
Right. You don't have the vocabulary to be able to
Right.
speak
And
it
the emotional
eloquently. Yeah.
stability, I'd break down, and
Yeah.
I got
Of
panic
course.
attacks that lasted 3 to 4 hours because they were so severe. And my brain just was like, all right, we're doing a cascade effect now. And my parents are like, is he dying? What the hell's going on here? And eventually they learned methods, and, they got me diagnosed, and we saw therapists, and they had to take it upon themselves because I was so young and presented with these issues. Now, if they ignored that, I'd probably be in prison by now just from being misunderstood. So it was really all due to them reinforcing it, sending me to these schools, keeping that momentum up throughout my entire life and trying to get me into these schools and trying to help me figure it out. And then at home, with the homework or with the assignments or with the understanding of this and that, they were always there trying to help me figure it out. So
That's
it's
amazing.
very
That's amazing
fortunate for
because
that.
they did not brush the issue under the rug.
No.
You got the extra help that you needed. They sought advice and support from outside sources.
Yeah.
That's
No, I'm very
that's
fortunate.
huge. And yes, so fortunate to have parents that love and care for you like that.
Yeah.
Um, just that in itself, I think, is, like you said, the difference in making or breaking it.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
yeah, I mean, It's so powerful.
Yeah, it changed everything, and it really that, I mean, that started the foundation of building the tools where now I'm helping them with their emotional, mental stuff that they buried, a long time ago, for because they were never allowed to face it, because of the way they were raised, because of the stress and the environmental situations they were put through, and because they just had to grow up, get used to it. Then they got so busy with work and life, and then they had a kid, and then they really couldn't worry about themselves all that too much, and they didn't. I mean, they're very good at handling external problems. They're probably some of the best external critical problem solvers, and they're quite good at handling internal issues because they've been through a myriad of them. But they're just now facing, I mean, and part of it's because I'm off to college now and I'm their only kid. So they don't have a distraction
Yeah,
except for
they
our
have the
dog, who
time
they
to.
may love more than me at this point. But
I mean, dogs are great. So
dogs are great, and I do love my dog, and he's always there, and he never talks back. So there's that. But so now they're having to face, things that I faced when I was 8, 9, 10, throughout my entire life. They're now realizing, oh, what, I'm sad for some reason. Like, yeah, you're having a depressive episode. Don't
no,
stress it.
that's
It's
that's a
normal.
big thing because I feel like parenting or teaching in a way that you weren't taught yourself
Yeah.
or the way that you haven't grown up yourself um is such a difficult feat, but
Hmm.
I think it's absolutely necessary for so many people because I mean some of us, like my parents, were very, I would say that they embodied the gentle parenting
Hmm.
uh concept before it had the name gentle parenting. They used logical consequences, things that they knew was
Yeah.
going to be more effective for me than just like spanking me or something
Yeah.
like that.
No, my parents too.
Yeah, and so I'm
Yeah.
thankful for that. And so I try to parent in a similar way because I'm like, hey, I came out okay. Like I'll try to do the
Yeah.
same thing with my kids,
Exactly. What
And
could go
then
wrong?
yeah, but
Yeah.
like as far as teaching went, I learned in a very traditional setting. And so then I go into a classroom and then I'm like trying to change it up and do something completely different, project based or inquiry based or hands-on and things like that, things that I would have eaten up as a kid. I would have
Yeah.
loved to do things like that. And to teach that way is a constant learning curve.
It
It's
is.
like it's a regular thing. And so I really applaud the parents that and the educators that are in, they look inside and they say, hey, like there's a better way to do this than what I was used to. And it's a lot more
Absolutely.
work to learn this new thing, but it's worth the effort. And it's a big
Yeah.
deal.
No, it's so important to be able, in throughout your life, to be a lifelong learner,
Yeah.
in and outside the classroom. And while classrooms and teachers and educators and parents are the people who bolster that, and probably spark that flame of curiosity and excitement to go and learn elsewhere, um, it's hard to maintain that desire throughout the course of your life. So being a lifelong learner is something that takes just as much work as anything else. And but there are things in life that are teaching you things more subtly. I think part of the reason why, going to school for when you're a kid, I mean, even now, I'm like, oh God, I gotta go to school. Like, I don't hate school. I
Yeah.
I, I appreciate the the things that school and education, even if it's not always perfect, can give us, because there are people in the world who can't have that. And when you see and hear about that, you're like, well, that's not only unfair, it's inhumane. But
Right.
but you know, it's not fun. A lot of the public and
Yeah.
traditional systems, and life isn't fun, and life isn't fair. And I do think that right now we're in this weird point, and I'm realizing this now because I'm raised by parents with two different philosophies who still came together, loved me, and never treated me wrong in any capacity. But my dad was always a little more stern when I was growing up. He was always there. He was always loving. I was never, no capital punishment, nothing like that, or corporal, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
None
I know
of
what you
none of
mean.
that. Nothing like that. But he was always more stern. He was always just like, I know you don't want to go to school. I understand. He's like, are you having a panic attack? I'm like, no, I just don't want to go. He's like, well, too bad. You have to. He's like,
Yeah.
if you're not having a severe anxiety attack or panic attack, or your mind isn't about to jump off a bridge, then you just got to push through it. It sucks. Sometimes we don't want to do this, but you have to learn how to do it, because you're not gonna be always in a safe bubble where people could kind of help guide you, where we're gonna be there for you, sort of thing.
Right. Building
And
that grit and that tenacity is,
absolutely.
I think, the key. You could be naturally gifted in any way, but
Hmm.
if you don't have the work ethic to back it up, then
Yeah.
what? What do you do?
And my I think my parents, I think that was the one thing they were always worried about in some aspects, that like, are we being so gentle that he's gonna be uh too afraid of the world when its sharp edges present itself. And what they obviously, how could you, because they were moving at the same time and changing their lifestyles, they didn't account for how much moving as a child will make you so much tougher than anything else. um, and also having gay parents, and being bullied and harassed for that, while battling intrusive thoughts all at the same time, that built more grit and determination and the willpower that I have today than a lot of things. So while I was still taught by and nurtured by gentle parenting, and I understand the importance of emotional and mental stability and acknowledgement of such for adolescence,
Hmm.
I see myself as a parent, if I ever get to that point, kind of like, oh, hey, if you're having a bad day, don't worry about it. We'll figure it out. Who cares,
Hmm.
right? And then flip side, sometimes I'll be like, all right, but you got to stop being a baby about it. You got to get your ass up. Like, this is
Right.
not like, I understand it sucks, but there are people who have been through much worse than you, and they get up every day, so you can get up too.
Right.
Um, I think that helps spark motivation, and whatever helps that person get up and want to go do something as well. We have natural rewards, we have natural incentives, even as adults. You work to get to the weekend, maybe, so you can go have drinks with your friends, or so you can go out to a movie, or
Hmm.
whatever. Um, Kids need that too. And it's not rewarding because they're bad behavior. And a lot of times people judge my parents, oh, you're rewarding him, but he talks back. And they're like, he's not talking back, he's just talking. we didn't
Hmm.
we didn't say anything that would provoke. It's not an argument. He's just talking, he's just speaking, and if we're silencing him, he can't process things and learn.
It's a
um
big deal.
it's a huge deal, and in the South especially, and that's something I want to bring up, because I don't want to be negative throughout this episode, and I'm going to try not to be. But
No, speak your truth. We're
but
here.
I will say the education in the South is a completely different ballgame, and people who were not raised in those systems and weren't raised in other systems either. People who are purely just raised in the South on the general ed there don't know better, and the people who are purely raised in California or Washington State or New York State, whatever, won't understand that, one, in public schools especially. Now, the Orton Gillinghams, the Montessori's, and I'll talk about Montessori briefly. I know I'm eating up time here.
No, you're fine. Take your time. I have a
Those
great
will,
editor.
yeah, that's why I'm trying not to make this harder on myself. I'm like, because I know I'm going to be watching this. I'm like, all right, so why'd you keep talking, you idiot? You're
No, 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 no.
making the work
Please.
harder on myself. So,
No, you're dropping
ah,
gems. You're doing great.
okay,
Keep it
I'm
going.
glad. So in the South, so aside from the private schools and some of the better philosophies that we've discussed already,
Hmm.
um, in the more public or traditional education system for K through 12 in the South, a couple things. One, Southern schools have the worst funding.
Okay.
That plays a bigger factor than people realize, because, like, I mean, nowadays, funding, and unfortunately, teachers aren't getting paid enough. Schools aren't getting enough resources. I mean, those resources are being eaten up by special interests that don't actually benefit the betterment of American citizens, as well as the defense budget. Now, I do think having a better defense budget is good, because you look at
Sure.
what happened with Russia invading Ukraine, and in that moment, I'm like, I really, I'm not anti-military. I'm not a fan of war, but I understand the logistical importance of a military and a good standing one. And I saw that, and I'm like, wow, we should really be counting our blessings that we have such a powerful military that nobody would even try that with us, not at least currently. Um, so, but we do have we spend so much in military defense, and a lot of it is actually retroactively trying to fix old shipyards and things. We have a very inefficient internal logistics system in our military that doesn't keep up with the needs of the modern world.
Right.
And so we're investing too much in keeping old shipyards and planes in order. And while that's fine for a small allocation of the budget, a lot of it needs to be going towards technology and cybersecurity. And a lot of that money could be saved and kicked back to the American people. And it needs to be put into education.
100%.
Because if we lose
yes.
education, if that keeps slipping, it doesn't matter how strong our military is if we're a bunch of morons running around self-destructing ourselves. And as flawed as the American education system can be, it's not so flawed to the point where it's shown that if you get a proper education and you take it upon yourself, you're going to be a little better off than not, right? So anyway, in the South, the funding of that, federal funding is here nor there, just depends every year. And the state funding is worse at times or better, depending. California does better than Kentucky or South Carolina. South Carolina has one of the worst track records of public education. And so does Kentucky. And those schools are taught on the principle of authoritarianism. Just outright authoritarianism. There's nothing else to it. Yeah. Do as I say, and if you don't, you'll be punished. And usually the parents supported that. So there's no safety net. And there's a power dynamic. And when power is introduced in a place where there is definitely somebody who is not going to be in that same position, when there's leverage to be gained, there is abuse to be had every time. In every system in the world, if that exists, there is a possibility of it. And if it exists more rampantly and it's accepted, that just increases the chances where teachers and faculty are abusing their authority over people who don't have it. And in Kentucky in middle school, I had a teacher in the public junior middle school or whatever it's called, junior school,
junior high, yeah,
junior high. What a stupid way of saying it. Just call it middle school. It's not high school. Just why the extra words? It's a waste of energy.
Little baby high.
Yeah, baby high. Like, what are we, oxymoron state? Anyway, so in junior high, I went to a school called. I went to a city. I lived in Bowling Green, Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
There was no massacre there, by the way. I remember when that happened, when like Kellyanne Conway, like 4 or 5 years ago, were like, "Oh, there's this Bowling Green massacre in Kentucky."
Yeah, I remember hearing that.
And we all looked around, and I called some of my friends who lived there. I'm like, "Are you good?" And they're like, "Yeah." And they're like, and I saw, and it was like, "Yeah, it happened in 2013." I'm like, "I was there in 2013. It didn't happen. They're just making that up. Nobody knows of that place." So like, it's very weird. Anyway,
that's fascinating. Okay, yeah. Wow.
So the place where Corvettes are made and the place where Kellyanne Conway made everyone think there's a massacre. So it's a very small town, and their public education system sucks in Kentucky. And so in middle school, I had this teacher named Winchester, as in the rifle, and he was in 6th grade in our world history or civics class or whatever it was, something like that. He was teaching a couple things. He was teaching that overpopulation is a myth, and he was showing us a bunch of fake videos made by a cult, actually, who was taking a stance that overpopulation is a myth. And in this animated video that was quite entertaining for a 12-year-old who loves animation, they were saying like the population of India can fit in Texas. And I may be 12 and may not have known everything, but I was looking at it, I'm like, huh? Like, what? India is 1 billion plus people. And I'm like, no, that doesn't line up. And he was spewing his political beliefs, which you're not allowed to do in a public system. You're not allowed to talk about religion or politics. Some places you're like not allowed to the point where you'd be fired or get a slap on the wrist. Other places it's just not appropriate and you might get in trouble by the parents. Just depends. I don't know exactly what the standards were there, but they weren't very high because he just went on a rant one day about how Obama's like the Antichrist. And I'm like, well, I mean, you can believe that, but that's something that you keep to yourself. Also, we're 12. We can't vote. So who are you preaching to right now? Um, so he was trying to preach that and the overpopulation myth. And I remember one time I just had enough of it because these poor kids just kind of were eating it up. They're like, yeah, I guess. I mean, he's the teacher. He has to know something, right? And I'm looking around like, no, 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 he's lying. He's just lying. He's just making these are opinionated things. These are not facts. These are not part of the curriculum. And I just stood up and I said, okay, overpopulation isn't a myth. It's a very, very prevalent issue. We just don't live in an overpopulated town, dummy. And I didn't actually say the dummy part, but I
Well,
did
that's
say
good.
like I did say I was like, come on, man, that wait, it's not that's false. And then I said also, you're not allowed to speak your political, or he also got into why he's a Christian. Is that I'm like the separation of church and state. I knew this at 12. I'm like, you're not allowed to really talk about that. You could believe it. You could, hey, knock yourself out in your own
Yeah.
time privately. But we've got kids who are Muslim. We've got kids who are Jewish. I mean, we got all kinds of people at the school. So you don't need it. Man, he
So,
screamed at me.
what's interesting, if you don't mind me
Yeah,
interrupting,
yeah, no
is
problem.
the power that adults have over,
Yeah,
I don't know if it can't possibly occur to you every moment of every day whenever there's kids around you all the time,
sure.
right? That,
Yeah,
everything that comes out of your mouth, you're an authority at
you
some
are.
point,
Yeah,
and you carry so much power with
you
the
do.
things that you say, the things that you do. You're modeling when you don't even know that you're modeling,
Yeah.
and you're doing things like that. To be consciously aware of that as often as possible is such a huge thing, because that's such a big responsibility and undertaking as a person who's around children and developing minds all the time. Now, you're 12 in this scenario,
Mm.
and you alarm bells go off in your head going like, well, that's not correct. And you were talking about advocating for yourself earlier.
Yeah,
how
they
did
taught me
that
too well.
how did that play out for you? Like, because I went
Yeah,
to a school that was kind of similar, but it was a private school, so they could say whatever, right?
right.
They wanted, right? It was a private Christian school.
Gotcha.
So,
Yeah.
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 And
So,
so it's just one of those things where I was like, okay. And then if I asked questions, they just either like brushed me off or pointed me to like a passage in the Bible. And I was like, oh, okay. And it's fine. And to this day, I don't have a problem with it. It's just
right.
that's not how I'm going to address teaching that kind of stuff to my own children and things like that.
Yeah. Well, also you're at a Christian school, so
Yeah. And so it was different.
it'd be kind of weird if they didn't teach religion there. But um, yeah, no, they taught the advocating thing a little too well because then
Yeah.
at this age, the 3.5 years later, advocate for yourself, speak your mind, be honest, mixed with a little autism and mixed with no social awareness whatsoever. I have a tendency to talk back. I have a
Yeah.
tendency to speak just the facts or the
If you
data
feel,
when it's
yeah, if you feel like
so
something's wrong. Right.
horridly wrong. I keep my mouth shut a lot of the time because I'm like, wow, this idiot's almost done talking. But I mean, this was later. This was like months into him doing this.
Yeah.
And so I spoke up and he screamed at me, berated me, said all these mean things and such. And then and then sent me to detention. And I mean, my parents were furious over this guy. They wrote letters in school like, he's not teaching, he's teaching misinformation,
Right.
and earlier,
He's not
just
teaching, he's preaching.
yeah,
Like, he's
exactly,
just doing,
exactly. In like a
yeah.
year and a half earlier or something, I bounced between five or six schools in Kentucky alone. That was like the bulk of it. So almost every 4 to 6 months, or eight maybe, I was bouncing between the school. Um, from like I think I started with McNeil Elementary. I just didn't like it very much. I didn't like the people; they were kind of bullying me. And this Potter Gray Elementary thing, where I had this fifth grade teacher who was like our homeroom teacher, who we would
Mm-hmm.
constantly sing, and
Mm-hmm.
he was homophobic. And he didn't say anything like that was like outwardly homophobic. Obviously, he was smarter than that, but he definitely segregated me from everybody. He gave me more homework. He told me I was wrong on certain equations when I was right with the science and the equation. And I'm like, no, 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 I know I'm right about this one. There's a lot I don't know if I'm right about, but I'm pretty sure I'm right about this because it says it in the dictionary too.
Yeah.
Like, and they know more than me and they know more than you. And he's like, no, it's not how you do it. And in fact, many times it was the right answer. I just didn't do that one step he wanted, but
That
no one else did. But he honed in on me because I didn't do it.
I'm sorry you went through that. That hurts my heart.
Yeah, no, it's and I told my parents, and my parents felt it too, because when they had parent teacher conferences, he ignored one of my dads as if he wasn't there. He ghosted him. And of course, he did it to the wrong dad who has a slight temper and will stand up and say, don't ever treat my son this way and don't ever talk to me or don't ignore me like that. He's done that a couple times where my other dad's like, all right, sit down, shut up, stay calm. So I think I get a little bit of that temperament to stand up and say, hey, you're wrong here from him. So I'll
Good,
blame him for
good,
that.
good.
But so yeah, that teacher did that a lot. And he's just the insecure guy who was jealous of his brother because his brother was a college level minor basketball player who was going pro and he couldn't because he's stuck teaching elementary children. So
Yeah.
he was just stubborn and afraid of gay people, I guess. So yeah, so there's stuff like that. Um, and so by the time I finally got to that middle school and that teacher was teaching them, and at one point they had a field trip to the Creationism Museum.
I
So
didn't even know there was a thing.
there's a
Okay.
creationism museum in Kentucky. I'm very
Mm-hmm.
proud of it. And one of the schools I went to was doing a field trip to that on education merits. It's like, no, that's not educational. It's not even religious. It's a cult. It's just even religious scholars are like, huh, dinosaurs and Jesus Christ at the same time? You're getting your things confused, buddy. Like, no, that's not how that works. And I remember I was like, I'm taking religious exemption. And I did. I took a religious exemption from that trip because I don't believe in creationism. So
Yeah,
so weird
that's
stuff
something.
like that. And that it's not the case in every school. And I'd like to think that 10 and a half years or so later, that doesn't all hold true, but those schools are still standing. The Kentucky education system hasn't changed that much, and the funding hasn't changed that much. So I find it hard to believe that they could have possibly changed as much. I hope that they have, but it's a thing. It's a thing in the South. Education isn't as prioritized. Misinformation is just floating about because instructors abuse their authority, and that didn't just happen exclusively in elementary and middle school. It happened in high school a lot. Once I was in South Carolina and North Carolina for the bulk of my high school years, and I had a lot of good teachers, a lot of good private schools, but some of them, one time I had a teacher who's like, man, I wish I can. This is when I was in 10th grade. So I was 15. And um, I had this teacher, this English teacher, who was like, she was so mad at us because we were talking. And this was a slight hybrid of Orton Gillingham and a couple other things. So it
Mm-hmm.
was a better school. This was a private school in
Okay.
Charleston. And, this is 3, 4 years after Kentucky, after I moved away from there.
Mm-hmm.
And man, she said at one point, oh, I wish I could hit you kids. I'm looking around and I had two friends who know I have a tendency. Before that, I spoke out and got in a heated, contentious argument with a teacher the year before that because they were spewing emotional stuff. They were mad at us because their kid didn't get into a school. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry your kid didn't get in school, but you can't scream at us for 30 minutes and take away from our lecture, take away from our time, and then throw a little of your political beliefs and religious beliefs just because you're mad that your kid didn't get into this Tony private school.
Right.
That's not on us. We're just your students. You got to chill out.
Mm-hmm.
And she didn't like that. So then the next year, a different teacher, they said, oh, I wish I can hit you kids. And I looked around and I know it was just kind of a dickish remark that she was saying. And like part of me is like, don't go after that. I'm like, but she said some sly stuff like that throughout the year. And that one's like the most abrasive time she's ever come out with that. And she went a little more, she's like, yeah, I know we're not allowed to anymore, but if we were, man. And I'm looking around and I had a few friends who know me and they're like, I'm like, I'm gonna, and they're like, don't. I'm like, it's gonna happen. Hey, I'm only human. And I said, well, I, I remember the immediate thing I said is, okay, you could do that and you'll be in prison because that's child assault. It's a felony. it's child endangerment, it's assault, it's child abuse, it's a mix of all kinds of things. So yes, strike one of us. Do it. I dare you. Oh, she didn't like that. She wanted to at that moment.
I'm
So yeah,
sure.
I know I can be a little
Yeah.
contentious and be a little bit of a twerp at times, but I usually think I'm in the right, and maybe I'm dumb to speak out, but oh well, it happens.
Whatever.
Um,
Yeah, it's what you experienced, and
yeah,
that just is
it's
what
it
it
is what it
is.
is, but
Yeah.
I've learned
And
from
I'm
it.
sorry that you had to go through some of that.
Yeah, but I'd like to think that now, because of that, I'm better, more well-rounded, more experienced, and people don't always understand that I've been through these things, and a lot of people don't understand how bad it can really be and how it's still going on for people. I do want to say a few positive things real quick. I know we don't have as much time left, so um, in Kentucky. At the same time, even though I was bouncing between all these schools that were creating such negative experiences, there are two instances where I ended Kentucky on some of the best experiences I've ever had. Um, After the middle school debacle, quite frankly, like almost a month after he sent me to detention, and my parents were finally like, yeah, it's rampant. They're just not respecting him. They're homophobic, all these things. They're like,
Mm-hmm.
okay, we got to get you the hell out of this one too.
Mm-hmm.
And it sucked because we're running out of schools and options, and they were losing their mind. Like we would send him to a better school. There's just no options here. And we stumbled into a Montessori school, very small one. I mean, it was in a house. It was an old renovated house. It had about
Uh-huh.
40 people there total, very small.
Mm-hmm.
And they made a plea to the teacher. They're like, we don't have any options. And they were like, okay, well, you can maybe get an interview and maybe do it in the following year. And so for the rest of that, when they pulled me out the rest of that year and through summer, I did homeschooling with my dad. I forget the program we used online, but it was like a hybrid of an online module. They sent a bunch of books over.
It was a K-12 by chance?
Yeah, yeah, it was
Yeah.
K-12. That's what it
Okay.
was.
Yeah.
They think I'd know that one. That's easy. So I did
That
that.
one's
And
the nationwide one
yeah,
that's like easy
yeah.
to.
And it was really, really good because it
Mhm.
gave me time over the summer to brush up on things that I was left behind on in many schools. It allowed me to more freely express myself and to jump in and research things that I found interesting and sharpened those skills.
Yeah.
And so that really grounded the lifelong learning habits that my parents were always trying to instill. And then I transitioned into Montessori. I was 12.
Okay.
I've never done a Montessori school before.
Right.
Wow, what a learning curve.
Right. No kidding.
That, yeah, that was probably some of the most challenging in the beginning academic stuff I went through at that age because, you know, oh, we're gonna do math. I'm like, oh God, not again. I'm like, no, no, hear us out. It's with a large bead frame, an LBF
Yes.
or an SBF, small bead frame.
Yeah.
It's like, what? It's an abacus, essentially,
Mm-hmm.
a simplified abacus. And I'm just like, I don't know how to do math on paper. You expect me to? And to this day, I still don't know how to use a large bead frame because I ignored it. But anyway, um, I did the bare minimum I had to. So the way it worked is there were some instances where you had to do the Common Core, you had to do the basics, English, all that, math,
Yeah. Yeah.
history.
Yeah. Yeah.
But for the most part, you plan your day. So when you get
Mm-hmm.
into class, it's like a bunch of toys, a bunch of Montessori kits, very expensive, very heavy, very sharp, oddly enough. And I was the I was one of the oldest ones there. There's like four people between 10, 11, 12. I was the oldest one. There's one who was like 11 and a half, just behind me in age.
Mm-hmm.
I was the only male of my age demographic. The other three were females who I became close friends with.
Mm-hmm.
And then everyone else was little kids,
Mm-hmm.
9 and down.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that, for one, that taught me more in that year and a half, almost 2 years, on how to be around little kids, how to talk to them, how to be friends with them, how to play with them, how to learn to. I am a little kid. I am a big little kid. So
Good.
I
That's
definitely related to a lot of what they're like. Oh yeah, you're playing video games. I'm like, what video games you guys playing? And they're
yeah.
like, oh, I'm like, I'm playing more explicit stuff, but that's still cool. So stuff like that. And at the same time, I was learning right around this time, between 10 and 11, I knew I was getting interested in filmmaking. I was in doing theater stuff all my life. I also, 8, 9, 10, 11, not only that, I also started listening to rap music more, which was therapeutic to me.
Perfect
So
segue.
funny how that
Yes.
all kind of like
Yes. Yes.
leads to where I am now. But
Yeah.
but Montessori really allowed me to build my own lesson plans and to structure things the way I saw fit while still checking off the boxes. I had
Mm-hmm.
some great teachers from that, and that's when I was so interested in film. That's all I wanted to study, and so we only had one computer, and we didn't have as many. Wasn't film classes, so I had to go to the library every Wednesday and find a bunch of film books, and I just that was what I spent my reading time, and I geared 80% of all my stuff in that, and then the bare minimum that I had to do, like, oh, you just write a paper, or just do these math sheets, or use the LBF or whatever. I got through and did that.
So you
it's an
found your
incredible
interest
learning
in
experience.
film basically from the get-go, from being
Yeah,
a kid, and you've just been pursuing that to this day.
slowly but surely. Yeah,
That's
very
wonderful.
exhausting.
Yeah. And you're in your
Yeah,
senior year now. So are you
yeah,
graduating this? I know you mentioned your project is going into the summer.
yeah. I'm
Um,
graduating December.
in December.
So
Okay.
this is the
So
first
first
semester
semester
of
of your
the
senior
senior
year.
year. Yeah.
Okay,
So
wonderful.
second is in September.
Wow.
Yeah.
Good. Good,
So
good.
it's been a long journey.
That's awesome. And what do you plan to do when you're done with school? How do you think that your time's going to be spent if
Oh
you could
God.
predict?
Um, my goal is, well, I'm working on kind of on the ground level and pre-planning right now to build a production company. So with my roommate and friend who's going to be my business partner, we're building our own production studio so we can be able to film and make the movies and the mini series and TV shows that we want to make, and have that creative independence, and hopefully within years away from now, grow enough to be financially stable from that, or more stable, and to
Yeah.
hire people, and to just build a networking base where we can hire and do in-house stuff and pay better than the industry does, and really respect people's time, because that's an ongoing issue in the film industry. People's time, they get paid well. We get paid better than a lot of Americans do, but the time we put and the energy and how exhausting and back to back filmmaking is, you do 10 or 12 if you're lucky hour days back to back, but usually it's 16 to 18 when you start off.
Yes.
You
Yeah.
just, yes, you get paid better, but you just don't get paid enough for all that.
Yeah.
So eventually, to create a production studio where we respect the time, the energy, the emotional, mental well-being of all of our employees. But for now, it's just us going to be making awesome short films and try to make money off of it, which is one of the hardest things to do in the world. So
Well, that's
that's
awesome.
one of the goals,
Do you
one of the
have
many.
social media or a platform where we can check out your stuff,
Yeah,
or
yeah,
how to keep up with your projects and your
absolutely. Yeah, I go by PsyKick online, PsyKick, capital P, capital K. I'm also a rapper, so I'm also going to be making more rap albums. I'm working on 3 right now. Uh,
very
and
talented?
Thank you. So on Instagram, it's Psychic34, all lowercase, all one word.
Hmm.
And TikTok, all of that is the same. Facebook is just Psychic. Apple Music, Spotify is just Psychic. So, and then all of those places also have my super link, so you can just press that and see everything that I've done or made, or am currently doing. So, yeah, very exciting, very busy.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I have one more question for you before we
yeah.
end. Do you have a particularly fond or funny memory from being in school that you can share with us? It's kind of our sign off on the show.
Okay, really fond or funny. I've gotten many, but let's see. Um, I had this teacher in high school, in one of the high schools I really liked. His name is Mr. McDermott, and he was big on public speaking. And
Hmm.
it's weird because 16, or no, about 10 to 13 years after being hammered into, like, almost 10 years later, being hammered that, oh, you got to advocate, you got to speak up for yourself. I'm now taking a public speaking class that I'm required to take
Yeah.
from this teacher who I respected so dearly. And he was a really nice guy. And it was all building up. Our final project and presentation was an open mic event that we had to orchestrate and
Hmm.
perform for the entire school.
Yeah.
And that was very stressful. And I was doing the documentary filmmaking while also preparing my speech. And rehearsing it. And I don't like doing that. So it's very stressful. And I remember that, and we rehearsed in front of each other, but I remember that I kept telling my parents and I told myself, I was like, it's funny enough, what I was talking about was a little bit of my experiences in education and managing mental health.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of like the crux of the 5 minute open mic speech I had. But I'm like, that's just kind of boring. So I need to be more funny. And I'm like, but I can't write anything funny in the moment right now. And I'm like, I'll just riff it. I'm pretty funny in class. And I remember I told my professor that like a couple days before, and he looked at me dead in the face. He's like, I think you're great. He's like, but you really want to take the risk of just inserting jokes in your carefully planned 5 minutes? I'm like, yep, I can do it. And he's
I
like,
got a type 5, guys. It's
okay.
gonna be good.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't remember exactly what I said because I did improvise it, but I do remember that that day I was so stressed. I was filming everything, and then he's like, "Hey, it's your turn," and I was getting up there and I was shaking, and I remember there's some video of it in the archives of my dad's computer somewhere, but I remember I just sat down on a stool and I told my story, and I interjected it with jokes and laced it with all these lighthearted comedy things and some dark comedy too, and did some sly disses at the teachers who were horrible at the school without them realizing. They were looking right at me and they were laughing. I'm like, that's
Hey.
geared towards you, dummy. But they didn't catch it. And
That's all right.
so I don't remember the exact jokes, but I do remember that just being able to speak on my personal life and being able to allow humility and laughter in the equation when I'm speaking about things that can be considered so hardening or traumatic, really elevated the room and made people feel better about themselves and their experiences, and made me feel better that I'm allowed to speak and once again advocate for something that I understood to be my experience. So
Right.
I think at the end of the day that, when I look back, I am like, wow, that was one of many great moments I've had. And that as I've done more odd public speaking events where I just have to go up on stage and been asked just randomly, hey, can you open up for this person? Not as comedy, just for a speaker or something. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
me? I'm like, I'm in the crowd. What are you talking about? I had to do that once and I did fine. And so, but in the end, it's like those moments all kind of came together, and the whole deal with advocating and being truthful to yourself and allowing people to hear your story while entertaining them is kind of a core fundamental that I carry with me to this day when I make my music or make my films. It's like, well, tell some you use this platform and use your energy to tell something that's important, to educate or to enlighten or to show that someone's not alone, because I consume the same media. I listen to the music. I watch the movies. I'm a nerd. I like all this stuff. And when I was little, it helped me through my darkest points. So whenever I do something, I'm like, well, hopefully, not always, but hopefully it'll help somebody, or at the very least entertain them, and at the very best do both. And so that's something that's a moment in my education experience where that really culminated into highlighting what I still do today.
That's amazing and so beautifully put. And I really appreciate you joining me today
Yeah,
and telling
thank you
me
for
about
having
your
me.
experience, because I think that your unique perspective, experiences, everything that you've gone through and continue to go through, speaks to a very large population of who we're working with, the kids and the adults and everybody involved. And it gives us a moment to be reflective about that. So I really, 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 really want to thank you for coming on. And I
Yeah, no, thanks for
appreciate
having
you.
me.
And I look forward to continuing working with you. I think
Yeah,
you're wonderful.
thank you.
Thank you
Me
so
too.
much.